What is up, guys? Today I am going to be reacting to recent photos of Elon Musk shirtless on a yacht in Mykonos, Greece. And you may be saying, you're going to body shame him. This is not body shaming in any way, shape, or form. As you will see, this is a medical observation and my concerns for Elon's health based on the way he looks with his shirt off. So let's go to the photos of Elon Musk. As you can see in this first photo, we have a 51-year-old Elon Musk. His birthday is June 28th, 1971. I checked it. And you can see the first thing that I noticed when I looked at this was that his belly is very protuberant. It doesn't look like a lot of subcutaneous fat, which is the fat between the skin and the abdominal wall. It looks like a lot of fat in his viscera. We call this visceral fat. This is the fat around the organs, around the intestines, around the kidneys, around all of the organs in the abdominal cavity. We call this visceral fat, around the liver or liver fat. And this visceral fat is particularly harmful for humans. And it indicates metabolic dysfunction. It's been associated with inflammation and insulin resistance as well. So that's the first thing I noticed, is that he's very thick from front to back. You can see here, again, this protuberant belly that doesn't really look like subcutaneous skin. It looks more like visceral fat to me. Here's another photo, and you can see from the side angle that Elon is very wide front to back. This is visceral fat. This is what I worry about. One thing that I noticed is that based on these photos, Elon seems to have gained a lot of this visceral fat recently. This is a photo of Elon and Grimes from a number of years ago, and another one of Elon and Grimes more from the side. It's hard because he's wearing clothes. But in this photo and these photos of this tuxedo, you can see that he looks like he was much slimmer around the midsection. So when I saw this photo and all of the photos showing how thick he is, I began to think, wow, Elon looks like he's really become metabolically unhealthy. I'm sure he's under a great deal of stress. I hope his diet is good, but I suspect his diet is full of seed oils, processed sugars, and if you look at these photos, you know that he's drinking at least some alcohol. All of these could increase visceral adipose tissue, increasing his cardiovascular risk. My perspective is that Elon is a very brilliant human. Love him or hate him, he's a controversial character, but he's done a lot of good things for humans. We probably want him around. I don't want to see anybody harmed, and this visceral fat is no joke in any way, shape, or form, so it's important to highlight. Here's another side photo of Elon, and you can see how thick he is. This is the width of his arm, and his torso must be 3 to 4 times that, maybe even more. I compared with myself. I turned sideways. I had my arm here, and I thought, I'm much thinner this way than this photo. Elon is just very large in this front to back perspective, and this makes me think that there is a large amount of visceral fat in that abdomen and the attendant cardiovascular risk. Now, I thought it was kind of ironic that in April of this year, Elon called out Bill Gates in a tweet saying, in case you need to lose a boner fast, and he threw up the emoji for the pregnant man, which I've never really understood on Apple anyway, but Bill Gates doesn't look great either. I haven't seen any photos of Bill Gates with his shirt off, but you can see through the shirt that Bill Gates clearly has some gynecomastia, that's development of breast tissue in males, and some of adipose in his belly, whether it's visceral or subcutaneous, we're not sure. But Elon is not as protuberant, but just very, very thick. And let's be honest, if you look at the photos of Elon Musk, it's pretty clear that he does also have some gynecomastia, some breast tissue development on males, indicative of estrogen. This happens when people are overly obese. Their testosterone gets converted to estrogens in the fat tissue. This is not uncommon. So why am I so concerned about this for Elon? Well, articles like this, cardiovascular disease under the influence of excess visceral fat. You don't have to look far into the research to understand that when you're looking at this abdominal obesity, this intra-abdominal obesity, it's associated with inflammation, insulin resistance, liver fat, all kinds of problems like that. With treatment of abdominal obesity and excess visceral adipose tissue, an increase in patients' LDL particle size, and improvements in other cardiovascular risk factors, insulin levels, glucose tolerance, HDL, C-reactive protein, adiponectin levels can be achieved. So if you can fix that visceral adipose tissue, and this is the point of this video, to say, What should Elon do? He should take a serious look at his diet. I think the major driver of this visceral adipose tissue is probably seed oils and processed sugar. You change those things and Elon's adipose tissue becomes less pronounced overall. He loses weight, becomes more metabolically healthy, and I bet you would see him thin out in that front to back dimension. They say here, lifestyle change, including more physical activity, healthier nutritional habits, I'd agree with that, are the cornerstone of therapy for high-risk abdominal obese patients and with excess visceral adipose tissue. Totally agree with that. Interestingly, these authors also comment on rimonabant, which is a drug I've talked about in the past. It's banned in the US, but they say results from the Rio lipid study conducted in high-risk obese dyslipidemic patients provided scientific evidence that CB1 receptor blockade with rimonabant can induce significant weight loss, more importantly, improve the cardiometabolic risk profile beyond what could be explained by the weight loss effects of the drug. If you've heard me talk about rimonabant, you know that it blocks CB1, the cannabinoid 1 receptor, and you know that this makes me very suspicious that products of linoleic acid breakdown, specifically anandamide and 2-AG, as has been shown in animal models, could be activating that CB1 receptor. We know that cannabinoids like anandamide in the human brain or exogenous cannabinoids like THC or cannabidiol, if you're using marijuana, can affect satiety, can cause us to eat more. Blocking the CB1 receptor results in better metabolic profiles. I think satiety has a lot to do with this, and I suspect that these seed oils are both breaking our metabolism at the level of satiety and overeating in our fat cells, but a lot of it is tied to this CB1 receptor, and we know that breakdown products of linoleic acid can affect the cannabinoid system as well. We can also look at this article, localization of fat depots and cardiovascular disease risk. They say here, recent studies have indicated that accumulation of visceral fat rather than subcutaneous fat is associated with increased cardiometabolic risk. They also go on to say there's evidence that increasing the area of visceral fat can help protect against lipotoxicity. Perhaps the body stores things in the visceral depot as a way of preventing lipotoxicity, but it's very clear that excess visceral adiposity, this degree of thickness in the body, makes me very suspicious about this for Elon, is highly associated with cardiometabolic disease risk. Visceral fat and insulin resistance. What we know? One of the underlying mechanisms linking obesity, diabetes, and cardiovascular complications is subclinical inflammation, primarily arising in visceral adipose tissue. Adipocyte size, number, and polarization of lymphocytes and infiltrated macrophages are closely related to metabolic and obesity-related diseases. We know that when people become more viscerally fat, there's more inflammation, there's more invasion of immune cells into the visceral fat, and there are more inflammatory adipokines released from that depot. Inflammatory characteristics of different abdominal adipose tissue depots relate differently to metabolic risk factors for cardiovascular disease, distinct fat depots, and vascular risk factors. This is actually a survey of 28 men undergoing abdominal aortic surgery. They sampled 4 fat depots, subcutaneous fat, and 3 visceral adipose tissue deposits, the mesenteric, the omental, and the periaortic fat. What they found was that in contrast to other depots, the mesenteric adipose tissue inflammation was most strongly related to metabolic complications of obesity, as adipocyte size and crown-like structures were related to insulin resistance. They say mesenteric adipose tissue adipocyte size was associated with a 79% higher odds of having metabolic syndrome. What we know clearly from human pathology and pathophysiology is that as fat cells grow and they break as we become fatter and fatter, that is what triggers insulin resistance and metabolic dysfunction. When your fat cells can no longer divide, when they can no longer hyperplasia, they are stuck with hypertrophy, they become overly distended, they leak inflammatory mediators, they begin to spew out non-esterified fatty acids. So the bigger your adipocytes are, that was associated with a higher risk of metabolic syndrome. How do you break adipocytes? I think there's a lot of good evidence this is related to excess linoleic acid consumption in humans. So all of these are major reasons that I am really worried about the very likely possibility of significant amounts of adipose tissue within Elon Musk's visceral adipose tissue depot. I couldn't just end the video there because the other thing that really strikes me about Elon is that he's extremely white. That's probably the whitest skin I've seen in a very long time. If you look at this photo between a much more reasonably body composed human that looks to have very low amounts of visceral adipose tissue and Elon, you will notice that. You will notice the difference between Elon's thickness front to back. We talked about the visceral adipose tissue, but you will also notice the difference in skin tone. I don't know what this other gentleman's nationality is, but if you just look at this, what is your gut reaction? I would say the majority of people watching this will think, Elon looks very white. That doesn't look healthy. This other guy looks reasonably healthy. Why are we drawn to more tan individuals? Why is our default way of thinking that a tan human is healthier? I think this is probably because we have some sense as humans that being in the sun is good for us. I've talked about this many times. There are so many benefits to being in real sunlight with all of its wavelengths, including ultraviolet light, that you cannot replicate with a vitamin D pill. Sure, getting vitamin D from the sun is a benefit. You can replicate that with a vitamin D pill. But can you replicate nitric oxide, which is made in your skin in response to ultraviolet light that is associated with vasodilatation and lowering of cardiovascular disease risk? Can you duplicate the endorphins that are made in your skin that are associated with relaxation, feelings of well-being, and immune cell programming? No, you can't. Can you duplicate the hormonal effects of being in real sunlight with a vitamin D pill? You cannot. This is a very interesting paper from 1939 showing that there is a significant influence of ultraviolet radiation on the excretion of sex hormones in the male. If you read this paper, you will find that exposure of the chest and back to ultraviolet radiation increases male hormones, and interestingly, they also exposed the genitals to ultraviolet radiation and found that one particular androgen we don't hear about a lot, androsterone, increased significantly with genital irradiation versus chest and back irradiation with ultraviolet light. You can see that in this peak, that this is genital exposure. 5 irradiations of the genitals increased androsterone significantly above 3 or 5 irradiations of the chest. And in this experiment, similar things occurred. Irradiation of the genitals increased androsterone. Androsterone is not as potent an androgen as testosterone, but it may act as a pheromone. It is produced in the axilla, in the groin, in sebaceous glands, and it has some androgenic activity. These researchers have also looked at testosterone and other androgens, which clearly increase upon exposure to ultraviolet light. How do you duplicate that with a vitamin D pill? So when I see pictures of Elon looking this white, I think, okay, number one, this guy's super smart probably. He's working all of his time indoors, but surely his health would improve significantly and his brain would function better. His mood would be better. Perhaps he wouldn't be making bad food choices that I imagine he is making if he were exposed to some ultraviolet light. No matter where he is, he can get an ultraviolet light. He can get out in the sun at any latitude that will benefit him. I think he needs to be a lot more tan than he is now. The last thing I notice when I think about this is he's so white that he's probably covered in sunscreen. You guys know how I feel about most sunscreens. They're full of garbage compounds that are excreted in the poop and the urine, which means that they are absorbed through your skin, they circulate through your body, and now they are associated with cancer in many studies. There's actually many ongoing lawsuits with compounds like octocrylene, oxybenzones, all of these compounds in sunscreen that are not good for humans. Do not use those sunscreens that smell like plastic bananas, guys. You don't want that on your skin. It's absorbed in your body. I don't know if Elon has sunscreen on in these photos. If he doesn't, he most certainly got a pretty bad burn because he's in Mykonos on a yacht. If he does, then all of those compounds are circulating in his body and doing nothing good for his hormones, which are probably a little bit messed up. In general, we can tell that from the way he looks. So again, this is not body shaming. This is my concerned opinion for his physical, mental health, his overall metabolic health based on these photos. I hope he will change his diet and become a healthier human, and that anyone looking at this may be able to look at themselves in the mirror and see, are you thick from the front to the back in your abdomen? Are you full of visceral adipose tissue? What is your fasting insulin? What is Elon's fasting insulin? I would love to know. I would wager at least $1,000 that it is not less than 10 micro IU per ml. And that means that Elon is insulin resistant for sure. The range that I'd like to see a fasting insulin at is less than 5 micro IU per ml. If you listen to my recent podcast of my labs, you know that my most recent fasting insulin was 2.4 micro IU per ml, despite eating tons of fruit and honey in my diet, which don't give you increased visceral adipose tissue or make you insulin resistant. They just give you good sources of carbohydrates so that you can live your life. That's a separate podcast. So these are my reactions to these recent photos of Elon Musk. I'm worried about him. All right, guys, that's it for this video. See you soon.